I wonder if you have ever considered that your eating habits could change everything. And I know we're in an age where we do hear about our eating habits, maybe that they can change our personal health. Even as a child, I heard, you are what you eat. Eating habits are important to personal health. And perhaps you've considered how your own eating habits might contribute to sustainability or environmental issues. I had a friend who was a 30-something in my last church who told me one time that if we could channel all the grain that goes to cattle in our nation alone straight to people, we would not have any problems with hunger. So maybe you've considered how your eating habits might change issues related to sustainability. But today, I want to invite you to consider how your eating habits could change everything, at least from Jesus' perspective, change the whole world. I'm going to plant that seed with you, and I'm using the plant the seed image intentionally. I will also admit that this is a season when I have been thinking about food. Summer is my favorite season for food. And at the farmer's market yesterday, getting to buy tomatoes that were red all the way through, peaches that if you bite into them, drip right down your chin, melon you could smell yards away, or sweet, sweet corn. Maybe you love this season for food too. I'll also admit too that with the Olympics in Paris, getting to think about this culture that could take 2 eggs in an iron skillet and a little bit of cheese and turn it into a fluffy omelet or a simple vinaigrette on greens. Food has been on my mind. Maybe your mind has been on food too. And in this week, when the gospel passage is Jesus' miracle of feeding, let's just say, a whole lot of people, it's usually called 5,000, but let's just say that number stands in for a whole lot. In this season of food abundance, if not for everyone everywhere, at least for us in our part of the world, we do stand in contrast with a very large group of people who were gathered to hear Jesus, all getting hungry. It's a reminder of potential food insecurity then and potential food insecurity now. Jesus wanted to make a statement, though, because there was a chance that in this world where the idea of food as a commodity existed, but before a time of mass production, there was this chance that people were buying into this myth of food scarcity. All bread was made by hand. Fish would have come from a local river or sea. But it was also a world where Judean farmers were beginning to lose land that had been in their families for centuries. The communities were being removed from their source of food. So there's an ongoing question for Jesus' community and their eating habits, but also a question for us. How will you trust that God will provide? In our time, I'm guessing for most of us here, it's not so much trusting that God will provide food. Maybe it's retirement or insurance or medical coverage, but for many of our neighbors, it is a more basic concern, whether it's food, shelter, clean water, or relief from the heat. No matter who we are, though, this idea of scarcity, and it can relate to food, can creep into our mindsets. We can all fall into the thinking that there's just not enough of something or that we can't afford it. The FDA publishes their economic research and online, and on their website, you can see how price increases in 2022 compared to 2021, probably driven by the pandemic, that price increases for food were about 10%. A little less if you shopped in the grocery store, but a little more if you shopped or ate in a restaurant. There's also a thing called shrinkflation. In the news this week, there was an effort by Chipotle to talk about how they still gave generous servings, even though the servings for your burrito bowl had gotten smaller relative to the cost. When Philip responds to Jesus' question about feeding, he's operating from that same tendency to see food as scarce. He knows, because it's in his community too, the staggering price of trying to feed people. And while in other Gospels, Jesus instructs the disciples to feed the crowd, in John's Gospel, Andrew sounds like he's onto something when he notices this child bringing forth food. Something different is going on here, and in terms of how this miracle story is told. In this gospel, the child's simple offering becomes enough. As I said to the children earlier, we don't know exactly how it happened. And I tend to follow the thought that the miracle occurred not just when Jesus asked everybody to sit down, but when in sitting down they realized we have enough food right here for everyone. Maybe they remembered the story of the manna in the wilderness and realized that they had already received food for everyone right there. They had just forgotten it was all manna. They had forgotten that God had already provided. But somehow with Jesus they remember, and that little bit, those loaves and fish became a lot. Scarcity turned into abundance. I've wondered how we might make that same concept of trusting God, of remembering that God does provide, one of our eating habits. Living as though not only all our food comes from God, but there is enough for everyone. There's enough for everyone to have all the good food, all the good things we need. So the first eating habit, how will you trust? And the second is, how will you share as part of a community? It's a little bit more of a challenge for us in the US and other developing countries where eating alone is common. I got a little help from artificial intelligence this morning. I don't think this is a made-up statistic, though. In 2015, a report cited by NPR found that 46% of all adult meals and snacks are eaten alone. Now that was almost 10 years ago. Between 2015 and now, think how much more often you may eat alone than you did then. And eating alone, even though it has been traced maybe to some issues in our personal health, there are probably some good practical reasons to eat together in community. But with Jesus, if we want to follow Jesus, it seems that there's an even more important reason. When I eat alone, it's easier for me to think that the food I'm eating is all about meeting my own personal needs. I tend to forget that what I eat has something in common with all the other people who are eating and their food. And therefore, I personally have something in common with them. With Jesus, most meals already happened in community. And Jesus knew that something happened when people sat down together. Scripture is specific for some reason that there was a great deal of grass. There was plenty of room for everybody who had gathered to sit down and share. How will you share? How will being part of a community become one of your eating habits? And I say that not just so you can eat more meals with other people, but how is the food you are eating connecting you with a larger community? Now, I know there are some very practical ways that this happens at Chevy Chase Presbyterian Church. And one of the things I love is that, like many Presbyterian churches, after worship, there is a time for everybody who is here to gather downstairs around a little bit of food. A couple weeks ago when I was here, someone shared with me some grapes. And I don't know if she knew that those grapes were just what I needed right at that point. I needed a little something after leading worship, and just that act of love was powerful. So there's the very practical sense of sharing food together. But I wonder if you stopped to think that it's not just the act of making sure we have enough grapes or cookies or coffee, but a way of sharing God's goodness and a way of experiencing what happens when we share this together. I also know, because I saw them coming in, that there is a plethora of zucchini and squash on a table just to my right outside this door. And that one of you, I think his name is Mark, brings to share the bounty of his garden. So it's meant to be shared. It's not meant just to be kept for ourselves. I want to invite you, too, to think how your eating might connect you with a larger community of people who are truly in need of food. And I know because you all, as a congregation, have connections with Bread for the World. I know that many of you served at Miriam's Kitchen. I know you know about people who are hungry in our community and in our world. But as you are eating, I wonder if there is something that might happen at a meal that connects you, that helps you see them as your neighbors. When I was a kid, we used to do this thing called 2 cents a meal, where we would put 2 pennies or a nickel in a can at every meal we shared around our table. I also know that and I think that in some ways the kids downstairs might be learning this, not so much with food, but as they are thinking about school in the fall, what does it mean to get some more backpacks ready for kids who might not be able to afford one on their own? How are you making that a habit, not just with backpacks, but with all your meals? I want to share with you the story of someone who has inspired me lately. She's become one of my heroes, and she's a 30-something who grew up in a Presbyterian church that could very well have been Chevy Chase. It wasn't, but I can imagine this kind of thing happening right here. Her name is Maggie Kane, and if you look on her LinkedIn website, you'll see that she lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, that she graduated from college with a degree in Italian, but something happened along the way. She had thought she was going to go work in Italy, but she ended up staying home in Raleigh, partly because when she was a college student, she had gotten involved through her Presbyterian campus ministry in efforts to feed her neighbors who were experiencing food insecurity. Some of them may have been without permanent shelter. One of the stories she tells is of a friend who had lost his job recently, and she would take him out to eat. And when she took him out to eat, he would share. He didn't like to go to a fancy sit-down restaurant. He preferred the kind with a buffet where you could go back. And when she asked him why, he said, "People don't stare at me when I want to go back for more. This is a place where I can fit in and do the same thing as everyone else." What Maggie realized is that we need more places, and at least in her community in Raleigh, North Carolina, needed more places where a whole community could gather around a shared table, where it was okay if you needed more after the meal was over, and you could go back and nobody would stare or think any less of you. She wanted it to be a place where people could come if they could eat somewhere else or if they didn't have any choice, and where all would be welcome. So when she was probably 23 or 24, she got a group of people together, and she came up with this idea that she called a place at the table. It happens now to be a restaurant about 3 blocks away from the state capitol in Raleigh. So people come from the state capitol, but they also come from the other direction too, a community where many people live in tents or come to receive social services. There's a room for everybody at the place at the table. This has become sort of a phenomenon in Raleigh too. It's become nationally recognized, and I think last year, Maggie was one of the North Carolinians of the year because she had a vision, and a vision that I think represents Christ's own for what it looks like for eating together to become a different kind of habit, to become one where community is created and people learn to see each other as neighbors who never saw each other that way before. Now, we may not all be at the Maggie Kane level of making community one of our eating habits, but I don't think that means we can't start right where we are. So this week, I want to invite you to 2 things. One is for your personal eating. And as you are getting ready to maybe take a bite of a big red tomato, maybe cut into one of the squashes that's right out here and set it up on your grill this afternoon. Think about what that piece of food represents and how it's a good gift from God. I will tell you that it's a lot easier with a fresh vegetable or piece of fruit than it is with something packaged. There is nothing wrong with packaged food, but it's a lot harder to make the connection of how that piece of food comes straight from God. How will you make trust in God's ability to provide, not just for you, but everyone, one of your eating habits this week? And then the second is an invitation. As you prepare this week for the big meal that Jesus prepared for us all, the one we've come to call the Lord's Supper, what is one thing you can do that connects your eating to that of a larger community, to the need of a community beyond your own home or even your own church to be fed? And I invite you, whether it's putting 2 cents in a can, or volunteering some time, or making a donation to one of the many amazing feeding efforts right here in Washington, D.C., I invite you to do one thing that connects your eating to the needs of a larger community. In a church I served several years ago, they would, every communion Sunday, also bring food so that the food that was received at their communion table also helped to fill a local food pantry. It was a cool idea. I'm not at the point where I can say, Try that. Maybe that's something for Chevy Chase in the future. But I want you to imagine how the food and the meal that Jesus has prepared also invites you to do what that little boy did long ago, to bring some of what you have forward so that others might be fed, so that you might be reminded that there is plenty of food for all, and that in the scheme of things, your eating habits can change everything. Friends, may it be so. And may you know the power of God, the Spirit of God using you to do all kinds of things, even as you eat. Amen.